So the new transom is in the boat already. We've fixed the bunks on the trailer, so it's now supported. So I decided to start on the stringers. Now the first thing I did was go along with a thin cutting blade and a grinder, and I cut the tops off the stringers, the caps, the fiberglass caps off the stringers. Now, because they had used, I don't know, cedar, fir, some sort of wood, it was so waterlogged, and I wasn't quite sure. I think it was cedar. I think it was a combination of being a fairly oily wood and not using a chop strand mat. The fiberglass roving wasn't stuck to the stringers at all. In fact, when I cut the caps off the stringers, I just went to the back and yanked up on both stringers, the wood parts, and the whole thing just popped out like a great big rotten wooden ladder with the bulkheads attached and everything. It just came out in one big chunk. So what I did after that was I just went along again with a thin cutting wheel on a grinder. I found it to be a very good tool for doing that. Some other guys have mentioned that they will cut theirs out with a Sawzall blade and basically use it like almost like a fillet knife and cut the stringers out. Again, use what works for you. I just went along and then carefully cut the remains of the stringer fiberglass as close to the hull as I could. Then I switched to another grinder that I had a grinding disc on and started grinding. Now, when you're doing any of this grinding on the transom or on the bottom, just remember it is going to create a huge amount of dust. Make sure you wear safety glasses because those bits in the eyeballs, you don't want glass bits in your eyeballs. I don't anyway. Wear a dust mask because, well, I don't want glass bits in my lungs. And what I found is when I'm doing the grinding portion, I just had a wet-dry vac, a big shop vac with one of the bigger diameter hoses running. And you quickly find out which way most of the dust is going to be blowing. Well, stick the nozzle of the vacuum over there. Even if you don't want to have a big dust collector, just put the nozzle of the vacuum over there. It's dramatic how much it reduces the dust in the air. The other thing I discovered, well, I knew this, but fiberglass polyester resin stinks. When you're letting it cure, my garage is attached to my house. So what I did was I actually installed a bathroom fan, just a small bathroom fan in the ceiling, ported to the other side of the garage. So it sucked some of the fumes out. Made a huge difference. Doesn't need to be big, just something to be constantly pulling the fumes out, get some airflow in the right direction. Anyway, back to the grinding of the stringers. So the grinding of the stringers, once you've cut those tabs that stick up from the floor, you go along with a grinder and just grind down to some clean fiberglass. You want to get any of the residue out, and you want to go out, I'd say 3 or 4 inches at least on each side of where the stringers need to be, so you have something to tab them to, and then you're going to want to clean that down later. Before you start cutting the stringers out, what you need to do is do some careful measurements. Measure the height of the stringers, the top height, measure the spacing of the stringers, measure the bulkheads, measure everything you can think of, engine mounts, any of those types of things. Measure from existing surfaces that you know are not going to change while you're doing the construction, because you need reference points. So whether that means putting a board across the top of the gunnels of the boat, and measuring down from there to get the height, measuring from the edge of the cap down or whatever. But make sure you have some measurements from reference points that are going to be there after your stringers are gone and after your floor is gone and after whatever is gone. Because just remember, if you just measure from stringer to stringer and suddenly the stringers aren't there, that doesn't work anymore. You've tabbed extra fiberglass onto the transom, and maybe your reference points have changed. So make sure you measure from reference points that are going to be there later. And write this down somewhere that you're not going to lose it, because it's no fun to suddenly be guessing and suddenly you have no way to go back. Anyway, okay, so now when you have the stringers all ground out and all the surfaces clean, you need to start cutting new stringers. Now, I use 3/4 inch plywood for this. In my boat, it was an 18.5, or actually a 17.5 foot boat, even though it's listed as an 18.5, go figure. I don't know how they do that. 3/4 inch plywood is sufficient. I doubled it up where the engine mounts are in the back, and then from there forward I went with a single layer of 3/4 inch plywood. Remember, when it's boxed in, glassed in, it's incredibly strong. To figure out the heights of the stringers, you can either put a string line at the top of where the stringer is supposed to be and then measure down at various points, or you can do what I did, where I figured out what the maximum height of the stringer was going to be close to the transom. I cut a board and laminated boards together to create the stringer of the right length and the maximum height. So assume it was, let's say, 8 inches at the back. I can't remember what mine was, but let's say it was 8 inches. And at the front, the stringer tapers down to about 1 inch where it meets the front bulkhead ahead of where the dash is. The problem is it's not a straight line across the bottom. It's a curve, and it's a variable curve, the bottom of the stringer. So what I did was I set the stringer in so it was sitting on the hull at the front, at the shortest point, and then I elevated the back with blocks to make sure that it was at a consistent level above where it needed to be, the top of it, but so that the top was level. So let's say it needed to be 8 inches at the back, 1 inch at the front. I cut an 8-inch high board all the way for the full length. Set it at the front. So now at the back, I just elevated it 7 inches from where it needed to be. And that gave me a good starting point. And then I went and created a little block of wood to use as a scribe with a pencil on top, and set that scribe at, if I'm doing this correctly, on the outside of the stringer at 7 inches, and followed the contour of the boat and scribed that to the side of the stringer, so that I ended up with a line the same shape as the bottom of the boat. Then I pulled the stringer out and then cut along that line with my jigsaw. But I remember I cut at an angle. I put the jigsaw blade at an angle to allow for the slope of the boat side to side, so that the outer part of the stringer was following my line. The inner part, it left the stringer a little bit taller. By doing that, I ended up with a stringer. I had to do some sanding afterwards on a few spots for a few bumps and high spots, but it was a way of getting a stringer that was going to follow the contour of the boat. Did that for both sides, and just remember, both one side to the other side are going to be different. These boats are not perfect, especially the old ones, and even though you think it's going to be a mirror image, it's not. Anyway, set the stringers in place, cut bulkheads, all of that, figured out you leave a small gap. I left maybe 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of an inch. I used some cedar door shims as spacers, so that the stringers were not sitting right on the hull. Once that was all set in place, and the bulkheads were attached to the stringers, I used some stainless steel wood screws and some glue, waterproof glue, to do that. I then went along and tabbed the stringers in with some fiberglass and resin, fiberglass strips and some resin on the inside, so the downhill side of the hull, to set them in place, let that cure. Once they were securely attached, I mixed up a somewhat semi-thick mixture of this peanut butter resin mixture with Cabosil chopped strand fiberglass, and kind of worked my way along and poured that in from the upper side of the stringer, and used the little old window squeegee, like a rubber window tint squeegee, to squeeze it in under the stringers, so that, and you can see it by watching the fiberglass that's cured on the inside, you can see it coming in. So that created the layer underneath the stringer to the hull. Once that was cured, tabbed in the upper side of the stringers to the hull, and then proceeded to laminate a couple layers of the 18-ounce weave and fiberglass over the entire stringers and bulkhead structure. As you can see in one of these pictures, of how I layered that in. Once that was all set, I cut some plywood. Again, careful measuring, cut the plywood, test fit it for a floor. The bottom side of the floor got sealed with a layer of fiberglass and resin. And then once that was cured, I mixed up some more fairly thick fiberglass resin mixture and put that on top of all the stringers, bulkheads, set the floor in place, made sure it was securely down on those, and then let that set in place. Once that was fully cured, I went in and tabbed the sides of the floor to the hull, and then covered the entire floor with some more fiberglass to seal it all in. You can see in some of these pictures what I also did was, unlike the old original engine setup in these boats where they just had an engine lid, I created a bulkhead just ahead of the engine so that I created a completely separate engine compartment, and so that I would actually have a separate bilge for the front part of the boat. And you can see the hole in the floor is to access the forward bilge, and then I would have a second bilge pump under the engine for the engine compartment. And then I had plans to create an actual hinged engine lid, which I did later, over the engine compartment. So I put that in as well. I put the bulkhead in that divided the two compartments. Anyway, now the boat is structurally done. The next thing is to turn to the outside of the boat.